What's up everyone, and welcome back to the comms channel. We're now finally ready to build our solar node, and what I envision with these solar nodes is using them for remote locations. For example, we're planning on deploying these at the local ham radio towers at high elevation. But for home use, I have a power over Ethernet build that I'm working on, and I'll have a video on that soon. This will use a lot of the same parts as the solar build. If you have concerns over the use of 18650 batteries in your environment, be sure to watch my video on this that covers this, which I'll include a link to in the video description below. Before we get into the build, many of you likely remember the acrylic boards I've been offering on my Etsy shop. I have some exciting news, and this is part of why this video's been delayed. A viewer in Switzerland named Luca emailed me with the recommendation of using custom PCB boards instead of acrylic, and sent me down a bit of a rabbit hole. I've done some projects using custom PCB boards from other people, like this Nucleo TNC for packet radio from MobileLink, which is actually the first video and series that I've done on my channel here. I've never considered creating my own custom PCB board, however, but I think this would be a great idea for this project that would make it easier for all of you to set up your Meshtastic devices, make them more professional looking, and require purchasing less parts. So since we're in the current situation where the enclosures are out of stock, and it looks like we have about another week before the Meshtastic Starter Kits are back in stock, I'm going to see if I can come up with a custom PCB board for this build and offer that on Etsy instead. For those of you who have already ordered and received your acrylic boards, I'll be sending you new PCB boards as a replacement to the acrylic board if you're interested. This won't include the battery holders, however, since you've already received that with your order. And these will be sent to you free of charge, of course, because you didn't really have the option for PCB when you made your order. I do realize that many of you are eager to get started on your builds though, especially if you've gotten the parts before they've went out of stock, so I'm considering offering a limited run of the acrylic plates on Etsy again with the stock I have left over. But I wanted to leave that up to y'all, so I've created a poll to see if this is something that has enough interest. So please go ahead and let me know where you stand by voting in the poll, and I'll include a link to this in the video description. With that said, let's go ahead and jump in and get started with our solar build. As I mentioned in an earlier update, if an item is out of stock on these Amazon links with multiple sizes, the link will just take you to the first size listed instead of saying that the item is out of stock. I generally just have the parts list in the video description, but because of this issue, I wanted to include the parts that have different size options in this video to help make sure people aren't ordering the incorrect parts. So as you're ordering the parts, please be sure to reference this part of the video and ensure you're getting the correct size parts. So the first thing we'll want to do is drill a hole for the antenna mount. For this, we'll need the enclosure, a ruler, a drill, and a 5/8 drill bit. The placement is important so the antenna cable doesn't interfere with the solar and battery plug on the Whiz block. With the enclosure opened and the buckles facing to the right, the top right side is where we'll want to drill the hole for the antenna. So let's latch the door back on and flip the enclosure over. You'll notice on this side that there's these ridges. Grab your ruler and line it up with the second ridge like so. Once you have it lined up, we want to find a spot towards the top where we can drill the hole, but also leave enough room for the antenna to fit. Right about the 1/2 inch mark looks to be good, so let's grab a marker and put a mark at the 1/2 inch mark. With that marked, we're now ready to drill our hole. Line up the drill bit to our mark and start drilling. Once we have the hole drilled, we'll need to clean up these rough edges around the hole. I'm using this deburring tool I have here, but you can use a pocket knife or something similar to clean up these edges. You'll want to clean up both the outside and inside of the hole. With that cleaned up, let's grab our end connector and check the fitment by pushing it through the hole here. Grab the end connector and unscrew the nut and remove the washer and lock washer from it. Go ahead and put the end connector through the hole and put the washer, lock washer, nut back on. Now go ahead and grab the antenna and screw that on and check that everything fits well, and it looks like we're good here. If you didn't want to go the end connector route, the SMA connector I recommended will fit into the same size hole. If everything fits as it should, we can go ahead and take them back out and we'll be ready to move on to the next part, which will be cutting the hole for the solar panel to fit in. In case you notice some slight differences, since the enclosure for the original build is the exact same size, I'm using the video from that build for this cutting part since the measurements are going to be the same. So grab a ruler and then mark the following on the enclosure door. be 2 inches from the top, 3/4 of an inch from each side, and 2 3/4 from the bottom. The hole itself will end up being 1 5/8 by 2 3/8. Once we have that marked, we'll need a Dremel tool with a cutting bit to cut the hole. Be sure to wear safety glasses since there can sometimes be bits of plastic flying up at your face for this part. Also, this stuff is nasty, so be sure to cut this outside or in a very well ventilated area. After cutting, we'll have some melted plastic along the edges on the inside and outside that we'll want to clean up. In the original video, I used a file to take care of these edges, but I found that using something with a sharp edge to shave off the melted plastic works as well. Then use some sandpaper to smooth things out a bit once you've done that. We'll want to be able to make sure that the panel sits flush against the enclosure door. Once that is done, grab the solar panel, run the cables to the hole, and check the fitment of it to make sure that it fits flush against the enclosure door. Next, we'll want to sand the top of the enclosure door with coarse sandpaper to help the adhesive grab on better. Since my last video, a number of sailors recommended using 3M 5200 as the adhesive and swear by it. I put some on my test build and pulled on the solar panel to where I felt it would break if I continued, and it stayed put, so this stuff seems to be the real deal. But be sure to wear gloves and not wear anything that you care about in case you get some on yourself, and do this in a well-ventilated area as well. Now, I didn't do this at first, but I found that putting the USB cable of the solar panel through the hole and setting it upright against something like I'm doing here before putting the adhesive on makes the process easier and less messy. This part of the video was before I started putting the cable through the hole first, so that's why you don't see it here. So first we'll need to make a complete circle around the hole we cut to create a waterproof seal. Then add some adhesive to the remaining area. Now that we have the adhesive on, we can carefully put the panel on and make sure to put it in the correct orientation, where the side with the sticker and cables coming out goes on the part with more surface area above the hole. Then look at the edge of the panel and the edge of the enclosure door and line them up to be level. Once those are lined up, clean off any excess adhesive. Then lay down a few paper towels, lay our device with the solar panel face down onto the paper towels, and then stack something heavy on top like books like I'm doing here. Then we'll need to let this sit for 24 to 48 hours. With that, everything for the enclosure is done and we can move on to working on the internals while we let that sit. Next, we'll need to solder the battery holders and power cable to the battery holder. You'll have two similar cables, one is for solar and one is for the battery. The one for solar will have a smaller connector on it. So grab the battery cable, which is the one with a bigger connector on it, and we'll solder this to the battery holder. It's helpful to have a good helping hand set like I have here to hold the battery holder while we work on it. I like to keep the positive side on the right, which means it'll be on the left when you have the battery holder face down to solder. First, cut a red wire to size to fit between the two soldering points on the battery holder here. I like to bend the wire around for stability. With that on there, we're ready to solder both sides on. Give it a look and make sure we have a good solder. Once you've done that, we'll do the same with the black wire for the negative side. With both sides soldered on, we're now ready to solder on the battery cable to the battery holders. Solder on one of the soldering points and check that everything looks good. Then go ahead and flip it around the other side and solder on the same end for that side. When you're done, it should look something like what we have here. If you're using multiple holders, solder the additional holders in a similar fashion to what we did with the first one, and then solder the holders together. If you're using the plate I offer on Etsy, I recommend mounting the holders to the plate first to make the process easier. It'll come with the plate and hardware to mount the Whiz block and battery holders. You'll have two separate bags. This bag with the standoffs is for the Whiz block, and the other bag is for the battery holders. Starting from the top, line up the holes for the first battery holder and then secure it with the included screws and nuts from the bag. Then continue on down and do the same for the rest of them. Once we have those put together, we can begin soldering them together, but be careful not to get too close to the board and melt it. When completed, they should all be wired together like this. Next, we'll need to solder the USB cable to the solar cable. I've done all of mine this way with wiring a male USB-A cable to the solar cable. But technically, you could cut the cost of the USB-A cable and cut the USB cable coming out the solar panel and solder the wires in that same manner that we're about to go over. Now I'm using heat shrink to protect the wires after I'm done, so I'm going to slide that over the solar cable before soldering. Using the helping hands to position the wires close to each other and then solder them together. Once they're soldered together, we can slide the heat shrink over the soldering point and then apply heat to shrink the heat shrink over it. If you're using one of the plates I offer, then you'll have hardware to mount the Whiz block, which will be in the bag with the standoffs. Let's grab the Whiz block and go ahead and mount it. The top of the plate will have 4 holes that are smaller than the rest in a rectangular shape. The top right one being a little further right than the hole below it. The hole that is a little off should be on the right side of the plate. If it's on the left, then you'll need to flip the plate over to the other side. Once we've confirmed that it's oriented properly, we can put a standoff into the top of each hole and then secure it with a nut. With those on, we can then mount the Whiz block to the top and secure it with the screws. With everything mounted to the plate, we can go ahead and flash the latest version of Meshtastic to the Whiz block. This process has been made even simpler with the new flasher. Before we do this and power it on the Whiz block, we want to make sure that we have antennas connected to it so we don't burn up the radio. The Whiz block comes with 2 of these PCB board antennas. One is for the LoRa radio and the other is for Bluetooth and should be labeled as such. If you look at the Whiz block core, you'll see antenna connectors for these labeled LoRa and BLE for Bluetooth. Go ahead and connect these up, and once we've done that, we can go ahead and connect the Whiz block to our computer using the USB cable. With that connected, we're now ready to flash. Go ahead and open up a Chromium-based web browser like Google Chrome. If you're on Windows, you can use the Microsoft Edge browser. Once we have that opened, go to flasher.meshtastic.org. Then click on the Select Target Device button and scroll down and select Rack 4631. Then click on the Select Firmware Version button and select the version you want. And I'm going to go with the latest stable version. Now go ahead and click on the Flash button, and if you look at the Whiz block, there's a small button beside the USB port on it. Press this button 2 times quickly to go into the firmware update mode. It'll appear as a flash drive on your computer named RAK4631. So once we've done that and we confirmed that the flash drive is appearing, right click on the Download UF2 button, and then click Save As, and then look for the drive named RAK4631. Select that and then hit Save. This will save the file to our Whiz block device and it'll flash and reboot. Once that's rebooted, we can now connect our phone to it via Bluetooth and configure it using the Meshtastic app. I've already done a video showing this process, and I'll include a link to that in the video description below if you're not familiar. But I'll give a quick hint that when connecting a device that doesn't have a screen on it, you want to use the default Bluetooth pin of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So with that, our device is up and running, and now we just have to wait for the adhesive to cure for 24 to 48 hours before we continue. In the meantime, this would be a great time to review my playlist for the Getting Started with Meshtastic series and then the Meshtastic Advanced series, so you can hit the ground running with all the knowledge needed for a successful Meshtastic setup. And I'll include links to these playlists in the video description below. After the adhesive has had 24 to 48 hours to cure, we can finish up by mounting the plate. One thing to note is that all the fumes from the adhesive will be built up inside the enclosure while it's curing, so you may want to open it up outside and let it air out before continuing. To mount the plate, we'll first remove the grid plate that comes with the enclosure and set aside the screws, as we'll be reusing them for the new plate. Before we mount the new plate, be sure to check which side is positive and negative. Since the wires are hard to see after we mount the plate, we want to use our marker to mark each side with a plus and a minus sign so we know which way to orient the batteries. This is very, very important because if you put the batteries in with the incorrect polarity, you'll burn up your radio and let the magic smoke out as a sacrifice to the RF gods. Now that we have the positive and negative sides marked, we can go ahead and place our plate down and route the battery cable through the corner here and then secure it with the screws. Before we insert the batteries, I want to quickly go over the difference between having batteries wired in parallel versus series. Having batteries wired in parallel will give you more capacity. Let's use these 18650 batteries, for example, which are 3.7 volts. And let's say ours have a capacity of 3000 milliamp hours. If we add another battery and wire them in parallel, we'll stay at 3.7 volts, but we'll increase our capacity to 6000 milliamp hours and get more battery life. In the case of our build here, this is what we're after as we're adding batteries to increase battery life. Batteries wired in series will have the opposite effect. Adding batteries will increase the voltage. So in our example, wiring 2 batteries in series will keep the capacity at 3000 milliamp hours and increase the voltage to 7.4 volts. We want to avoid this as the Whiz block board we're using for this build has a maximum voltage of 4.3 volts and would burn up if we had these wired in series. So this is why we've marked the positive and negative sides on the enclosure. At the time of this video, I've been unable to find battery holders with no polarity markings on them, so you'll see that these battery holders have plus and minus signs on them. It's very important to ignore these markings and go with what we've marked on the side of the enclosure. Generally, 18650 batteries will have the positive and negative sides marked, as you can see here with this green battery. But if you ordered these red Sanyo brand ones that Rockland offers, they do not have these markings on them. But you will see that one side is completely flat and the other side has this elevated bit with a blue ring around it. This side with the blue ring is the positive side. If you have these, let's make things more easily visible and mark the negative and positive side on each one with a marker. With those marked, we can now place them into the battery holders with all of them in the same orientation that matches with what we've marked on the side of the enclosure. We're just about ready to mount the device outside, but first, now that we have the device inside the enclosure, we want to use our external antenna, so unplug the small LoRa PCB board antenna and set it aside somewhere in case we need it later. The other PCB antenna labeled BLE is for Bluetooth and will stay on. The back of the Bluetooth antenna has adhesive and we can peel this off and mount it out of the way in the opposite corner of where the LoRa antenna will go. Let's grab our end connector or SMA connector if you went that route and push it through the antenna hole and then secure it, but don't over tighten it. With that on, go ahead and connect the cable to the LoRa antenna port on our Whiz block. And now we can go ahead and screw our antenna on. If you're using the setup that tilts the solar panel at an angle or using an antenna that's too big to mount directly to the enclosure, you'll be screwing the coax cable coming from the antenna to the end connector on the enclosure. Now we can mount the pole bracket to the enclosure. The enclosure comes with this bag with screws and clips for mounting the enclosure to the side of something. We're going to use these screws to screw the pole mount to the enclosure. If you're not using the tilting bracket with your setup, go ahead and grab the pole mounting bracket and line up the holes on the side of the bracket with the most holes on it, like so. Have the bracket facing outward like this, and then secure it with the screws. If you are using the tilting bracket, you'll want to secure the bracket to the enclosure using the other side that only has 4 holes. And in this case, we want the bracket facing inward instead of outward. Once that is secured to the enclosure, we can mount the tilting bracket to the bracket we just secured to the enclosure. We need to be sure that we orient it correctly so it tilts up instead of down. To orient it correctly, we want to have the part of the bracket that sticks out be on the right side when the enclosure is face down, with the antenna on top like you see here. Then we can secure the brackets together using some M6 screws, washers, and nuts. I bought these from Home Depot, but you should be able to find them at most hardware stores. And the size I'm using is M6 1.0 by 16 millimeter. Now with that on, we'll want to figure out what angle we need to set for optimal sun. To do this, I use a calculator from sunsolartilt.com, and I'll include a link to this in a video description. Once we're at the website, click on use your current location or enter in your zip code if you prefer. Once you do that, it'll give you a list of tilt angles. You can get the best angle by month, season, or best all year angle. Now I just want to set mine and forget it without having to adjust it later, so I'm just going to use the best year-round angle for mine. And as we can see here, it's an angle just under 30 degrees for us here. If we look at the bracket, there's a few options for adjustments. This long sliding adjustment or the series of holes. The angles for the series of holes start at 0 and go up 10 degrees for each hole. So for our angle that's just under 30, I'm going to set it up to use the hole for 30 degrees. To do that, we're going to place this part of the bracket with the teeth and line it up to the hole that we want. Put that up against the pole and then put the U-bolt through it and secure it with the washer, lock washer, and nut the tilt bracket came with. Then tighten it up by hand for now, and next go ahead and mount your antenna to the top of the pole using the hardware your antenna came with. Then connect the coax to the antenna and then run that down to the enclosure. Move the enclosure up or down as necessary depending on where it needs to be to connect to the antenna cable. Once that's in the proper place, we can go ahead and tighten it up using a wrench. With everything mounted, we're now ready to start plugging things in. So go ahead and grab the USB cable we soldered to the solar wire and plug that into the USB cable coming from the solar panel. Then go ahead and plug that into the port labeled solar, which will be the smaller of the two. Now we can go ahead and plug our batteries into the battery port, and our device should boot up and be ready to communicate using Meshtastic. As far as the use and configuration of Meshtastic, the Getting Started and Advanced series of videos I did will be a great resource to get up and running. Since this is a DIY build, of course feel free to adjust things to fit your needs. There have been a lot of awesome emails and messages on Discord showing their setups and how they went about it, like this one by Matt, and this one from Cybermage, who opted for a larger enclosure and is also putting a Raspberry Pi with an SDR in there. A viewer who goes by Bob mentioned using a hydrophobic vent, which is something I'll probably add to my build and post about in a community post with details here on YouTube. So adjust the build and make it your own, and what I'm showing is just what has worked for us here, so don't feel obligated to follow everything we did here to a T, and make it your own and what will work best for you. And the final closing note, I want to address this comment because if this is true, what I mentioned in an earlier video about being able to run on battery power alone for just over 2 months with the 6 batteries is slightly incorrect. The gist of this comment is basically with a large amount of batteries, like the 6 possible batteries this build can do, it'll be difficult for it to reach 100% via solar charging. So that means that instead of getting around a little over 2 months of battery, it'll be a little less if the battery consistently hovers at 80%, which would be about half a week or so under 2 months, if we're going by my test of 1.5 weeks of battery life per 18650 battery. Since we've been good with just 2 batteries here, we've never tested with 6. So I'll be testing this theory out with the 6 battery node that I built for this video and report back later. I think this slight difference of 2 months of battery won't be a big issue for people, but I just wanted to make sure I mention that and stay tuned for the testing that I'll be doing on this theory. That'll do it for this build video, and I hope you found it useful and enjoy making your own solar node for Meshtastic. If you're enjoying these videos, be sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already done so. Also, be sure to join our Discord and join in on the conversation and check out everyone's builds, and be sure to post your own there as well. I hope to see you there. Thank you all and have a good one.